Hello, it's good to be with you again for our adult Sunday school class, and this is our final week in David's story arc. Next week, we'll take a little bit of a break away from where we've been narratively in the arc of David and the sequence of 2 Samuel. Next week, when we pick up, the week after that, we'll be picking up, of course, with the story of Solomon, but that will cause us to cross over into the threshold of 1 Kings. And we actually only have about 5 Sundays left in this quarter before we wind up moving out of this quarter and deeper into the material of 2 Kings a little bit. Actually a little bit of 1 Kings and some of 2 Kings. And then we start actually looking at the prophets. So more to come. But anyway, so here we'll find our place in 2 Samuel chapter 11 and 12. Let's read these passages together. We will come together for a moment of prayer. And then after that, we will dig right in. So 2 Samuel 11, and if you're used to my style, then you should know with the various verse breaks that you see there in the upper left corner, and then, of course, down here as well, that there will be 3 little dots that will show up every now and again, and that's where the verses break and then move to the next section. So where I will read verses 2 through 5, and then you will see these 3 little dots. That puts us at verses 14 through 17. And then these 3 little dots, verses 26 through 27. The same will be said for the passage below that. All right. One evening, David got up from his bed and strolled around on the rooftop of the palace. From the roof, he saw a young woman bathing, a very beautiful woman. So David sent someone to inquire about her, and he said, "Isn't this Bathsheba, daughter of Eliam and wife of Uriah the Hittite?" Your translation may say Hittite. Most of us are very familiar with Uriah being a Hittite. Not sure why the translation committee of the CSB chose to use the word Hittite, but nonetheless, that's what we have. David sent messengers to her, and when she came to him, he slept with her. Now she had just been purifying herself from her uncleanness. Afterwards, she returned home. The woman conceived and sent word to inform David, "I am pregnant." Oh, excuse me. The next morning, David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it with Uriah. In the letter he wrote, "Put Uriah at the front of the fiercest fighting, then withdraw from him so that when he is struck down, he dies." When Joab was besieging the city, he put Uriah in the place where he knew the best enemy soldiers were. Then the men of the city came out and attacked Joab, and some of the men from David's soldiers fell in battle. Uriah the Hittite, or Hittite, also died. When Uriah's wife heard that her husband Uriah had died, she mourned for him. When the time of mourning ended, David had brought her to his house. She became his wife, bore him a son. However, the Lord considered what David had done to be evil. Now in 2 Samuel 12, so the Lord sent Nathan to David. When he arrived, he said to him, "There were 2 men in a certain city, one rich and the other poor. The rich man had very large flocks and herds, but the poor man had nothing except one small ewe lamb that he had bought. He raised her, and she grew up with him and with his children. From his meager food she would eat, from his cup she would drink, and in his arms she would sleep. She was like a daughter to him. Now a traveler came to the rich man, but the rich man could not bring himself to take one of his own sheep or cattle to prepare for the traveler who had come to him. Instead, he took the poor man's lamb and prepared it for his guest." David was infuriated with the man and said to Nathan, "As the Lord lives, this man who did this deserves to die. Because he has done this thing and shown no pity, he must pay 4 lambs for that lamb." Nathan replied to David, "You are the man. This is what the Lord God of Israel says. I anointed you king over Israel, and I rescued you from Saul. I gave your master's house to you and your master's wives into your arms, and I gave you the house of Israel and Judah, and if that was enough, I would have given you even more. Why then have you despised the Lord's command by doing what I consider evil? You struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword and took his wife as your own. You murdered him with the Ammonites' sword. Now therefore the sword will never leave your house, because you despised me and took the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your own wife." David responded to Nathan, "I have sinned against the Lord." Then Nathan replied to David, "And the Lord has taken away your sin. You will not die. However, because you treated the Lord with such contempt in this matter, the son born to you will die." Then Nathan went home. The Lord struck the baby that Uriah's wife had born to David. Sorry. And he became deathly ill. Then David comforted his wife Bathsheba. He went to her and slept with her. And she gave birth to a son and named him Solomon. the Lord loved him and sent a message to the prophet Nathan, who named him Jedediah, which means beloved of the Lord, because of the Lord. If you'll join me now for a moment of prayer. Lord Jesus, our King, as is the case every week when we have a chance to come together like this, we want to express our utter gratitude for the sheer fact that you have given us of your mercies every single day, that we have been allowed to walk with you since the last time we met here. Lord, you renew your mercies day in and day out in spite of our unworthiness to have that. Your love is ever present and it is ever clear to us. And again, Lord, we are grateful. It's my prayer that as we focus on these words, Lord, that you would please open our minds to aspects of this story that we are not familiar with. And as I ask often, Lord, I pray that you would help us to battle against familiarity. Because while there are many things to extrapolate from the segments that we've read from these two chapters, time would fail us to be able to go into all of them. But thankfully, considering what we are doing as a corporate body, that we will be focusing on this tomorrow, not only in Sunday school, but of course, when Bart has the chance to stand before us and deliver a sermon. And then, of course, on Wednesday night, reflecting back on this text even more. And while all of that is still not enough, I pray that you will help us to begin to see things that will challenge us, perhaps, in our continued reading of Scripture, and help us to appreciate a deeper sense of interconnectivity between these stories and what you were ultimately leading these authors to do in piecing together the fragments of information that lead us from one story to the next and in each story. We ask all this in your holy name, that you be glorified, and of course that we be challenged and edified. Amen. Because that is often what my intent is to try to do. There would be nothing wrong with spending however much time this lesson will wind up being in the end on just these passages, because there's quite a bit of information here, as goes doctrinal teaching with respect to sin and the sovereignty of the Lord and all manner of things that we could pick apart and discuss. But I actually don't want to take very much time at all to spend in the passages that we've read. And the reason is because my assumption is, and it may be wrong of me to assume this, but my assumption is, at least from those who I've had some feedback from, that you are all familiar with this story. This is something that you've grown up with in church, and you've heard it taught and preached many times over, and you could probably very easily recite the salient points of both of these chapters that we read with respect to what David did, how he conspired in his heart to sin against the Lord by taking Bathsheba unto himself, and of course conspired to kill Uriah after he realized Uriah was not going to do what David wanted him to help him as a co-conspirator, although unwittingly, to cover up David's crime. All that to say, there are many things that we could talk about pastorally from these two passages, but I don't want to do that because, again, another assumption I'm tacking into this is that I would think Bart is probably going to do that. I mean, after all, I don't want to make assumptions for him, but this is something of a pastor's bread and butter when you have a text as rich as this with respect to our attitude, as goes sin and entertaining the things that we are often tempted with and playing with the coiled up snake that we're wearing in a backpack, so to speak, pointing a phrase that a friend once shared with me that I like quite well. And it's certainly befitting with respect to how silly it is for us to play with sin, knowing very well that we could and probably will get bitten. And if we're the ones that get bitten, or I should say, we're not, or often not the only ones to get bitten. And so we could spend our time talking about that. But if that's what Bart is probably going to wind up doing tomorrow during the sermon hour, then it would only be a repeat of what I would be saying now. And so I would opt to do what we've been doing, and that is continue to march along the beat, or beside the beat of the drum, of seeing what the meta-narrative has to say with respect to this, right? So that's what we're going to focus on, is the larger context of the story and what's been going on around these passages Because last week we were in 2 Samuel 7 in the covenant that God made with David of an everlasting kingdom and a son who will sit upon his throne, that he will establish that son's kingdom forever, building this house for David, which of course is a dynasty of kings. And ultimately, this king that will come from David is the one who he will have build his house for him, and all the messianic connections that tie into that. So now that we are looking at the chapter material that interludes between 2 Samuel 7 and 11, it's important for us to appreciate that information, because the narrator and author of this story is not just simply putting that information there as a place filler. That information is helping us understand contextually what's going on here, as goes this moment in time when David is committing these egregious acts, what led up to that. But of course, we also have to appreciate the fact that oftentimes these authors are telescoping material onto itself. And what that means is that we don't really have a very strict or succinct timeline or even a time reference for how much time has passed between the moment David had this covenant given to him by the Lord, or I should say covenant invitation, and then the moment that David chooses to sin. So with that in mind, considering the fact that the information that is given to us is leaving out gaps of time, perhaps large gaps of time, we don't know how much has passed. The information that is given to us is done so very succinctly and with the purpose of helping us story build to understand what is going on in the text, as goes the larger themes that are embedded in this story that connect it to all that's come before and will help us see the repeated patterns that will go on after this. Okay, so it takes us back to 2 Samuel 8, in which we are going to begin to see that the image-bearing covenant partner, this being David, obviously, the king priest, considering the chapter material of 2 Samuel 5 and 6. In 2 Samuel 5, he is anointed king over all Israel. And of course, in 2 Samuel 6, there's this figure of David acting as a priest and wearing an ephod, and of course, offering the sacrifices every 6 paces wherever they happen to lie on the road between Obed-Edom's house and, of course, Jerusalem, where David is seeking to bring the ark to. And connecting the material together from both of those chapters, we have the picture resurrected from Genesis 1 of a king priest now properly installed on God's newly claimed cosmic mountain, right? We went over all that last week. And so in the material that moves on after that, we're going to see the theme of Eden expanding. So go with me on this. In 2 Samuel 8, you see the collection of verses. Going to read it all together. After this, David, and this of course is after David has received the covenant that God had given to him. After this, David defeated the Philistines. He subdued them. And he also defeated the Moabites. One can read into that he is subduing them as well. The Moabites became David's subjects, and they brought tribute. David also defeated Hadadezer, son of Rehob, king of Zobah. This would be a great idea, or I should say a great moment in time for you to consult a Bible map so that you can appreciate where these particular places are that we might not be familiar with. But the Philistines are sharing the western border of the land, west by southwest. And of course, Moab, we should be very familiar with where they are, because when one approaches the Dead Sea at the north and northeastern end of the Dead Sea, immediately across the Jordan, that is exactly where the kingdom of Moab would be. David also defeated the king of Zobah. Zobah is directly north of them, outside of the territorial holdings of Israel. And apparently, if you go on to read the text in a more full way than I'm giving you an understanding of here, Zobah apparently had subdued several kings himself, because as the battle will commence between Zobah, the Arameans, and the Ammonites, and of course, this is a battle that's really being instigated by the Ammonites, but because David has defeated Zobah, perhaps Zobah and his own kingdom, and of course, the kings that he has subdued and continue to be subject to him, may see this as an opportunity. And that by that, I mean, Zobah himself sees this as an opportunity to strike back at David. But by virtue of the fact he's been defeated, he's perhaps been weakened significantly by David and cannot withstand David himself. And so combining his forces with other Arameans from across the outside of Damascus across the Euphrates River, and of course the Ammonites, then perhaps this forms a coalition of kings that would be mighty enough to squash the Lion of Judah, that being David. But all that to say, in the end, once the Israelites thoroughly defeat the Ammonites, and of course Zobah, who has now become part of this coalition that the Ammonites have put together, that the kings that Zobah has subjected break their alliances with him, and they decide to subject themselves to David. And by virtue of that, now Zobah is virtually crushed. And the king that rules over them, that being Hadadezer. Anyway, David struck down 22,000 Aramean men, along with the silver and gold he had dedicated from all the nations that he had subdued. Now we have a larger list from Edom, which is the kingdom that is south by southeast of Israel. Of course, Moab, as we've mentioned, the Ammonites are directly north of them on the eastern side of the Jordan River. The Philistines, as we've already mentioned, directly south outside of the territorial holdings of Judah across the Negev Desert. And in the Negev Desert, we have the Amalekites, and of course, the spoil of Hadadezer, the son of Rahab, king of Zobah. So with all of this talk of David, if we consider the idea of him, we're going to use this box right here to just kind of represent Israel. And here we have Moab and Ammon. And here we have Philistia and so forth, Edom, and then the Amalekites. Up here would be Aram, Damascus. We have the Philistines. And of course, the kingdom of Zobah is up here. Hadadezer is their king. Forgive me if I confused you earlier by continuously referring to it as Zobah. I should have been saying Hadadezer because he is the king ruling over them. But anyway, David, of course, has consolidated all of this territory. He rules over now. And in speaking of defeating these other areas that surround him, he is not colonizing those areas. And so by virtue of that, while they are conquered, they are subdued. They are not doing what other kingdoms in the future, from the reference point of this story right here, will do. We should be familiar with the fact that when the Assyrians come and they defeat the northern kingdom of Israel after the kingdom is fractured, they will deport many of the Israelites and spread them out to different areas of the empire that Assyria has forged. And the Babylonians, once they conquer the Assyrians, will continue that practice. And of course, that carries out to Judah when they conquer them and then deport them out of the land. But David is not doing anything like that. Now, he will set up garrisons in several places. And if one were just to consider what this is painting a picture of here with respect to the fact that he is subduing Philistia because he has defeated many of their stronger cities. If you look at the account given by the chronicler in First Chronicles, you'll see that he takes Gath. It's written Gath in our translations, but it's pronounced Gath. And of course, that is one of their 5 capital cities, and he winds up taking much of the land that Israel had first conquered under Joshua, that Philistia had long since taken away from them and resettled themselves. Ziklag was one of those cities that originally belonged to Israel, but had been conquered by Philistia and then given to David and his men once they settled there. And of course, Amalek, and then Edom, Moab, Ammon, eventually, through the context of these stories, Aram, and then Zobah. Even all the way up here to the Euphrates River, he will establish garrisons, and he basically winds up conquering Damascus. And so with that, in subduing all of this, we have a much larger footprint of territory here that is under Israelite control outside of the space that has been solely given to just Israel. And if we go back to the Genesis prologue and remember what it was that God told the first king priest that he is supposed to do as he blessed them to be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth, to rule it, and of course to subdue it. And so it's easy to always look at it from the perspective of subduing by virtue of military might, strength, conquest. That is not the picture that God gave to Adam. But then again, Adam was not living in the theocratic state that Israel currently is. And so we have really no idea what the picture would have looked like with respect to Adam had Adam been faithful and not chosen to eat of the fruit that he was forbidden to. But there would have been no one out there to conquer from the biblical perspective. And so with that, if Adam had been blessed to be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, that of course would have started by filling the garden, and then to subdue the territory surrounding the garden once they eventually filled that space. Or perhaps even before they filled that space, maybe the Lord would have allowed them to venture out beyond that territory. But nonetheless, that's not the picture we have. But what David is doing here is that even though some of these bits of conquest look quite ugly, because considering what he does to Moab, he'll have the men lay down, I'm guessing maybe not head to foot, but perhaps beside one another, and he would measure off lengths of cord, and in 2 of those lengths, he would have all of those men executed, but leave 1 length of cord of men alive. So not to totally decimate the kingdom to the point where all the men were killed, to leave some of them alive. And one could easily question what the motive of that would have been. And in none of this do we have the Lord telling him to do that, or at least that we have record of. But in the spaces where those parts of the narrative fall, we really don't have any reason to suspect that the Lord is condemning this activity either. And so we really can't push the narrative one way or the other, just simply based off the way we think David is conducting himself. All that to simply say, what we do have a clear picture of from the intertextual link between these two is that David is subduing the territory around him, and who knows what the ultimate game plan would have been. But forging what legacy Jacob promised the descendant of Judah would have when he was giving that final bit of blessing and somewhat quasi-cursing to his sons before he finally closed his eyes, took his last breath, and was gathered to his ancestors. He promised this of Judah, that the scepter would not depart from him or from between his feet until whose right it is was to come from Judah. And of course, the obedience of the peoples belonged to him. Now, with that, we have a clear understanding that Jesus fits that bill better than any character in Scripture does. But building from the time this promise was given until we get to Jesus, we see several candidates along the way who could have potentially fit that bill. And that's the way the authors of the narrative aspect of this story is framing David to be. We are supposed to consider him as a potential prospect, as goes the fulfillment of this prophecy. And certainly the obedience, at least in the sense that they are subjugated, of these kingdoms that David has now brought to their very knees. He has deposed their kings, and for quite some time, we're talking centuries, many of them will go without kings and pay tribute to the kingdom of Israel or the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. All that to simply say, I think we have a good picture here of the idea of Eden expanding and what potentially could have happened within a few generations, because we would have to assume that as David conquers these territories, that the subjects that have now come to find themselves defeated and alive simply because David, the king over Israel, seems to allow it to be so, that they would be hostile to Israel and probably would have seized any opportunity to try to throw off the chains that Israel has now shackled them with, as goes forcing them to pony up tribute and, of course, press ganging some of their people into servitude and whatever the case might be, and would not have taken to the idea of their captors filling their land with their people if and when that moment ever came. But perhaps what would have happened in the process of time, maybe even beyond Solomon or Rehoboam, assuming those men had been faithful all of their days as David would have been, is that eventually those kingdoms would have started to, as Moses promised the Israelites would happen in the book of Deuteronomy, the words of wisdom he imposed upon them, and that is, when the nations see you walk by the wisdom and light of God's counsel, they will esteem you as being wise. And by virtue of that, it will increase the attractiveness of the God you serve to those people who have long since walked away from God. And perhaps it will cause them to abandon their gods in their shrines, and they will seek to worship Yahweh, the true God of not only Israel, but the universe. And perhaps the knowledge and wisdom of the Lord would have begun to eke out of Israel and slowly begin to fill the earth as God had intended to do through Adam, and ultimately as he continues to promise through his prophets, whether it's Isaiah in Isaiah 11, that the knowledge of the Lord will fill the earth as the water fills the seas, or Malachi, the incense and burnt offerings will be made to the Lord everywhere the sun rises. And so that's the inevitable goal that the Lord is reaching toward. And David could have easily here created a couple of large leaps toward that outcome that potentially several generations down the road would have not only seen all of these kingdoms become religiously or perhaps theocratically subdued willingly to the God of Israel, but even the kingdoms out beyond that. And it no doubt would have taken several generations to accomplish this until all the earth is subdued. But that seems to be the objective that the Lord has in mind here. And so in chapter 8 of 2 Samuel, verse 15, we have the writer saying that David reigned over all Israel, administering justice and righteousness for all his people, which takes us back to the words of Hannah in 1 Samuel chapter 2, where she promised that the Lord will bring judgment upon the earth, and he will do this by giving power to his king, and he will lift up the strength or source of strength of his anointed one, his Mashiach. And clearly these words being spoken with David on the horizon have him in the crosshairs as being the primary target of the fulfillment of this particular prophecy that Hannah is making. And then much later on, after David has been born and we have him firmly embedded in the narrative, then we have this moment where David is seeking to have a reward given to his men, not so much himself, but of course also trying to network, build, and make friends. There's a particular man by the name of Nabal, who is a rather wealthy shepherd, herdsman, who has his servants out in the field shearing their sheep. David lends his soldiers to protect them and keep them safe from marauders. And then he seeks to have some manner of recompense from Nabal by simply asking for him to invite his men to come and celebrate with Nabal and all of the other village people, as Nabal will throw a big feast honoring himself and, of course, all of the sheep that were sheared and the money this is going to bring in. And so this doesn't actually wind up boding well for Nabal because he rather despises David. And in the end, Nabal dies. Abigail has this moment there before Nabal does wind up succumbing to the wrath that God brings upon him, to prevent David from being the one who brings wrath upon him, because David and several hundred of his men had strapped swords on their side, and they were going to bring justice on Nabal's head for the insult that was paid to him. But Abigail met them in the way. And when she does, she says this to David when she's trying to succor him and prevent him from doing what he's about to do. She says, "For the Lord is certain to make a lasting dynasty for my Lord, because he fights the Lord's battles." That's important for us to remember, because at this point in the story, David's the rock star, doing all the right things, with the exception of a few moments where we could perhaps look and wonder as to whether or not David's motives are in the right place or whatever the case might be. All that to say, though, this is a fair assessment of the man who is one after the Lord's own heart. And she goes on to say, "Throughout your life, may evil not be found in you." Now, another place that we see not only the concept of justice here or righteousness in tow as well is, as we continue to story build beyond 2 Samuel 7, we've looked here at 2 Samuel 8. Now let's look a little bit at 2 Samuel 9, that entire chapter dedicated to this extraordinary measure of mercy that we've already alluded to in previous weeks, and we're not really going to fill in any more fully than we already have, just to simply reference the fact that this is causing David's trajectory here to rise all the higher here. Because what we should appreciate here is that there is quite a bit of parallelism going on here in this particular story between David and Saul. What we have here with Saul is that Saul, in 1 Samuel 11, has already been anointed king, right? Sorry. Let me change that, make it smaller. He's already been anointed king, so he's already on the rise. Then we have this moment where he has to face the serpent, and that being Nahash. We're going to fill this in here in just a minute. But I just want to give a representation here of what's going on. After the defeat of Nahash the Ammonite and the threat he imposed upon the Israelites, then Saul's story continues to be jettisoned upward because he is re-anointed as king, and now all the people seem to embrace him as king. There's the threat even of executing those who did not want Saul to originally be king. But that takes us on to, well, this is chapter 11, chapter 13, where we have that first moment where Saul was given the option to simply wait, as Samuel had told him to do before Samuel shows up, offers the sacrifice. Saul doesn't do that. We know how that story ends. And then after that particular moment, it's a sharp downturn for Saul. He does have the moment in 1 Samuel 15 to perhaps redeem himself, but he doesn't. In fact, that precipitates his fall that much faster. But even before we get to 15, we have the promise that the Lord has taken the kingdom from him and given it to one who is a man after the Lord's own heart. Now, when we go to David's story, we'll find a very similar approach, because after David is anointed as king, he will face Goliath, the first serpent that he will face. And then after that, he is jettisoned upward, as goes his trajectory, and we'll continue to see him rise. And of course, as he's risen even higher, ascended now to the position of king after Saul's demise, that now he has achieved covenant status with the Lord in 2 Samuel 7, something that Saul himself had never experienced. And he is truly at the zenith of his trek up this mountain, where he is not only by what he has done, but of course by the Lord's grace, but that coupled with the choices that David has made at the right moments and utilizing proper wisdom and strategy, that has led him to this keen moment of blessing. And then after this, David continues to rise, as we see through 1 Samuel 8 in the subduing of the nations, and now in 1 Samuel 9 with the blessing of Mephibosheth. Because what could have happened here is David could have utilized the conventional wisdom of any king around him, considering that he is now the progenitor of a brand new dynasty, leaving any rival claimants to the throne from the previous dynasty or house alive would have simply not been smart or prudent for him. If he didn't want the innocent blood on his hands, he could have perhaps sent them off into exile, but that always leaves a relative or family member alive, or multiple family members, who can continue to have more children of their own and produce more possible legitimate heirs, who eventually could give rise to rebellion, either instigating it within the land, or perhaps maybe hiring mercenaries that will be a paid army for them to come and oust either the person who has just taken the throne from them, or perhaps future descendants from that particular king. But David doesn't do that. In fact, David at this point isn't even sure who, if there are any male heirs that belong to the house of Saul who are still alive. But for the sake of Jonathan, and the fact that Jonathan was David's best friend and the son of Saul, for the sake of the friendship and covenant he made with Jonathan, whoever that heir might be, David wants to show that person kindness, and he wants to bestow upon him the immense blessing of giving everything that belonged to Saul to this male heir. He doesn't want to take from Saul even the best of what Saul has and give what David might esteem very little over to this male descendant. He wants to give everything, such that Saul's name is not forgotten in Israel, and not just simply the ancestral lands that belong to Saul by virtue of the fact that he's descended from Kish and is a Benjamite, but everything that Saul had amassed while he was king, presumably, will go to this male heir. And lo and behold, it's Jonathan's son, which makes him more of a threat, considering the fact that Jonathan was the heir apparent, the crown prince. And now his son, Mephibosheth, is the one who is identified by the servant who attends him, that being Ziba, because that was the person who David was connected to and saying, who is the person I may pass this blessing on to? And Ziba says, it's Mephibosheth, it's Jonathan's son. And while this may have pleased David, again, any other king from any other kingdom, and especially considering the fact that David and Jonathan made that covenant when David was not yet king. And even though Jonathan knew David would be king and affirmed that fact, things change. Things change a lot when men put crowns on their head and they begin to amass power. In fact, we'll see that from many of David's descendants, not very far removed from him in future stories. But all that to simply say, David does not go that route. David wants to show this immense measure of mercy and kindness to him, which is very reflective of what it was that Moses had said, as goes the law that the king must abide under, that pertains solely to him, from the Deuteronomical Code in chapter 17, where the final statements given regarding the king was that his heart will not be exalted above his countrymen. He will not turn from this command to the right or the left. He and his sons will continue reigning many years in Israel. If David had extinguished the surviving male members of the house of Saul, that clearly would have been seen as a gesture of him elevating himself above his countrymen. Everyone in Israel is equal. The king is no different than them. He's God's chosen representative, but that doesn't mean he exists above the law. In fact, if anything, he has greater restrictions imposed upon him by the law than the average ordinary citizen does. All that to say, David did not esteem himself more important than Mephibosheth, and he wanted to treat Mephibosheth as an equal to one of his own sons, like a prince in Israel, which he properly was, and allow him to continue to dine at his table all of his days. And we won't see any other king from the line of David do anything remotely similar to this. But with all of this going on, considering the fact that David seems to have bypassed Saul with respect to what's going on here, and he is climbing even higher and higher, what you can expect to see if we have appreciated anything about pattern development in stories that exist in not only Torah, but now the books of the prophets outside of Torah, what exactly do we think is going to happen next? And if you're guessing that the serpent is going to wind up finding his way into the story to attempt to try to corrupt things, then you would be absolutely right. Now, I don't say that as if to say, hold on a second, let me try to reestablish connection here with my iPad. I don't mean to say that as if to say that the serpent has not already been in play. Saul is anointed as king, and the serpent finds a way to attempt to try to trip Saul up, and that is through the existential threat of Nahash, the Ammonite, and the threat that he is attempting to impose upon the men of Jabesh Gilead, which of course could have applied to all Israel should Nahash have been successful. That existential threat is met with resounding defeat on the part of Israel, as God had anointed Saul, filled him with his spirit, and by virtue of that, in the way that the judges had before for the centuries since the days of Joshua to this moment, Saul leads them in a decisive victory. The same happens here with David. He is filled with the Spirit. The existential threat is this figure of Goliath, and David is going to go out and meet him. And so by virtue of that, we can appreciate that that has already played out somewhat in Saul's life with Nahash the Ammonite. And he goes out and he slaughters them. There are no survivors left, although Nahash is still alive. David has had this moment where he's faced the Philistine giant, their champion, Goliath. He slays him, not only by hitting him with a stone, but then he winds up cutting off his head. Notice the way that he was described, as we went into in previous weeks, with the bronze helmet, the bronze scale armor, all of this imagery meant to call the reader back to the serpent in the garden by virtue of the connection between the words in Hebrew that are used to be translated either serpent or bronze, and the fact that they all stem from the same three-letter Hebrew root word. All that to say, both Nahash and Goliath share many things in common in the fact that they are the existential threats against God's covenant people. They both seek to enslave them, because this is what the men of Jabesh said: make a treaty with us, we will serve you. This is what the Philistine is shouting out toward them: if I win against the man you send to me and I kill him, then you will be our servants and you will serve us, right? So in both of these stories, running concomitant with one another, Nahash and Goliath are the serpents. The existential threat is what was easily defeated. However, the internal threat is something that wound up tripping up Saul, because he had to face his own fear of his insecurity in being crowned king over the people, the very first king Israel had, and the fact that the men at the moment when the Philistines were attempting to try to set up battle formations and bring Israel back out into yet another armed conflict, the men, for whatever reason, are fleeing from Saul at Gilgal, and he offers the sacrifice rather than Samuel, and being disobedient to the prophet of the Lord. Remember, Moses said that the Lord will put his words into the mouth of the prophet, and the man is, or everyone is supposed to listen to what the prophet has to say. Kings are no exception to that. And Saul failed to do that. And by virtue of that, he winds up reaping the judgment of the Lord. David, on the other hand, has another existential threat thrown against, David winds up having a few small threats levied against him, because we've had several moments where David inquires of the Lord what it is that he's supposed to do, both before being king and after being crowned king. And with that, as David has continued that precedent, then what we see is that at this point, at least, David is not allowed power to corrupt his heart. And by virtue of that, he continues to shine all the more because God is bringing about his glory. And by virtue of that, glory to the covenant partner that he is working alongside of to accomplish his purposes. Remember what Lane had mentioned last week in preaching a sermon, that the Lord had blessed, and David realized this, that the Lord had blessed his people and he had exalted the kingdom of David for the sake of his own people, even though it made David shine all the brighter. But now, considering that the serpent is relentless and never seeks to give up, we have yet another moment here where the serpent is attempting to try to find a vulnerable crack in David's defenses by bringing about another existential threat, and it's one we're very familiar with. When we read the events of chapter 10 that precedes what we began our lesson with, which is, as you recall, is chapter 11. When we begin to read from chapter 10, we find that sometime later, the king of the Ammonites died, and his son Hanun became king in his place. And David says, I'll show kindness to Hanun, son of Nahash. Remember, from 1 Samuel 11, Nahash was known as an Ammonite. We can assume it's one and the same person here, given the close proximity in the stories and time between Saul, and considering that his immediate successor is David, that this Nahash in 1 Samuel 11 is the very same character that Saul wound up facing down, because Nahash apparently is not the title of an Ammonite king, but simply the name given to the person who was reigning at the time, because a different and distinct name is given to his son, that being Hanun. And for some reason, after the skirmish that Saul had with Nahash, maybe it was because of a common level of enmity, or I should say a common denominator of enmity between David and Saul, that David and Nahash found something to bond over. But either way, David esteemed Nahash to be a friend. So David wants to send an envoy of some of his men to Hanun, the newly crowned king over the Ammonites, and he says, just as his father showed kindness to me, so he wants to show kindness to Hanun. So David sent the emissaries to console Hanun concerning his father. However, when they arrived in the land, the Ammonite leaders said to Hanun, their lord, just because David has sent men with condolences for you, do you really believe he's showing respect for your father? Instead, hasn't David sent his emissaries in order to scout out the city, spy on it, and demolish it? So now we have the word of David's emissaries being offered to Hanun, that David has indeed sent them to give condolences and perhaps congratulatory remarks, that while Hanun has now been crowned king and he is to be congratulated for such, and may the blessings of the Lord, even though Hanun does not worship the God of Israel, be upon him, and may his days be long and his reign be plentiful, and all those things. David would also seek to express condolence that in order for this to happen, then Hanun's father had to wind up dying. Now we have the information being ponied up by Ammonite leaders and advisors to Hanun, who are saying that whatever those guys are saying, that's not their motive. Their motive is to come and spy out what you have and develop a strategic plan for how they're going to infiltrate our defenses and eventually wind up subduing us, considering everything that they have done to the surrounding kingdoms. All that to say, Hanun now stands before two different trees, two different sources of knowledge, of wisdom, and he has to choose which route he will take. And sadly, instead of believing the words of his friend David, he chooses to believe the lies of his own advisors. And by virtue of that, Hanun took David's emissaries, shaved off half their beards, cut their clothes in half at the hips, and sent them away, purposefully humiliating them. And anything he would have done beyond this would have just added to it all the more. He could have went so far as to kill them, and obviously word would have traveled back, perhaps even body parts would have traveled back to show David very clearly what Hanun thought of his emissaries. But either way, given the fact that the word makes it back to David, David comes to understand what has happened, and he clearly knows what this signifies. And so does Hanun and all the Ammonites, because it will go on to say the Ammonites realized they had become repulsive to David. So they preemptively, knowing that David is probably going to strike, hire mercenary armies in the tens of thousands to come to their side, Arameans and whatnot. The words reported to David, and he gathers all of Israel while these emissaries are holed up in Jericho for some time, to allow their beards to grow back and they don't have to come back to their families or the kingdom in this humiliated state. Then David musters the army and he crosses the Jordan, and he resoundingly crushes the forces of both Hanun and the Arameans who have come to his side. And when all this happens, when Hadadezer's subjects saw they have been defeated by Israel, they make peace with Israel and they wind up becoming their subjects. But this is why this is important, because the events of what's going on here in chapter 10, while it's broad in scope and many different peoples are involved, the Ammonites, being the instigators, are the ones who will bear the brunt of David's wrath. And it actually will serve to encapsulate the story of 2 Samuel 11 through 12, because what's going on here is 10 and obviously 13. And with respect to that, on in toward the end of 12 and the beginning of 13, what we're going to have here is this battle amongst the Ammonites, who starting here in 10 is going to find its way being the very circumstance at the beginning of chapter 11 that causes Joab and the army to go and lay siege to a city that eventually is going to be conquered. But during that time period, David has decided to stay home in Jerusalem, and by virtue of that, the incident with Bathsheba arises. So when Uriah is called home from the battlefront to try to help cover the sin up by virtue of David's plan, it's because the Ammonites are being laid siege to by David's army to crush them for what it was that they had done in insulting David and his men, as they did in chapter 10. So apparently the events of chapter 10, when they begin, and the initial wave of defeat led by David when he crossed the Jordan, probably happened somewhere toward the end of late fall, early winter. They bed down for the winter time. And then after that, once the spring comes, David seeks to launch the offensive again and attack them and make sure that they understand very clearly what it was that they had done and how David esteemed that. So it's important for us to appreciate that fact, because that, again, takes us into the context of 2 Samuel 11. So when the spring comes, the kings march out to war. David sends Joab and his officers to fight. We can speculate all day long that David should have been with the army. Had David been with the army, this incident never would have happened. That may be true, but what really has to be surmised from this is that this is a heart issue. That cannot be denied. By virtue of the fact this is a heart issue, what we wind up with is that David perhaps would have committed this at one point or another. Many people will use this as something of a sound wisdom principle to say that this is one of the reasons why when we have a tendency to be idle and we face temptation, we're more inclined to give into it, that we should attempt to try to stay busy or away from precarious situations. And I would certainly argue, yes, if you're an alcoholic, you have no business being in a bar or around people who even casually drink alcohol, because it very well may tempt you. David obviously has several wives, concubines. He's had many sons and daughters born to him at this point. One can say he has something of an infatuation with women, and that may have led him in his desire to want to have many wives and concubines connected to him, as many other kings around him did, and he may have felt that that was his privilege and right to have. All that to simply say, though, that because David was not short on female companionship, one would have to ask, what was the motivation behind him wanting Bathsheba? We're not going to get into that aspect of the story. Just want to throw that out there, because I think sometimes people have a tendency to get stuck a little bit too much in sermonizing the idea that David had no business being back in Jerusalem. He should have been out there with the army, and this never would have happened. I contend with that, because I don't think that's the case. I think this probably would have happened regardless of whether David was there or not. He very well may have been coming in after the conquest of this kingdom out in Ammon, and then by virtue of his first night home, he's strolling upon the precipice of his palace and whatnot, and wherever it is that we find him walking here in 2 Samuel 11, and by virtue of that, he sees Bathsheba, who is bathing herself. And granted, one can say, well, yes, but Uriah wouldn't have been home at this time, and David would not have attempted to try to, once he finds out who she is, have her come to the palace for anything. That may be, but we have no idea what the circumstances would have been at the time. And so all that to simply say, I think it's something that's almost inevitable that David would have faced a circumstance like this, in which David perhaps has probably faced circumstances like this before in the past, but he was able successfully to mitigate those circumstances by leaning upon the Lord. And this time he clearly does not. But we do have some intertextual connections here to appreciate as David is strolling around on the roof of his palace. From the roof, he saw a woman bathing, a very beautiful woman. And what do we have? But in the very Genesis prologue, the very thing that we have seen play out so many times using the very same word, with the woman who there in that context sees the tree, that what she is beholding with her eyes is good for food, it's delightful to look at, and it's desirable for obtaining wisdom. And of course, it's a moment here when David is having to discern and exercise wisdom. He should recognize that he's being tempted, and by virtue of that, he knows that what he is about to do, once he sends word to find out who she is, and apparently the person he wants to go and find this information out of or from, he's the one that steps up and says, oh, isn't that Bathsheba, Uriah's wife? So David is made keenly aware of who she is. And David is probably very familiar in a familial way, in a fraternous way with Uriah, because Uriah, remember, he's a Hittite. And by virtue of the fact that his name is Uriah, that is a Semitic name, and that, of course, is an Israelite name. And I would think that at some point Uriah had to undergo some sort of a perhaps covenant-bearing ceremony in which he winds up perhaps becoming an Israelite, and by virtue of that is conferred a new name, that being Uriah. All that to simply say, though, he will serve as one of David's mighty 30 men, his bodyguard. And so David, I'm sure, was intimately familiar with every one of those men on a first name basis. And assuming that Bathsheba was Israelite, and she may not have been, I don't really know, but assuming that she may have been Israelite, that she was brought into a marriage, or her hand was brokered by somebody who I'm guessing would have garnered the trust of Uriah enough to be able to convince Bathsheba's Israelite family to pass their daughter on to this man. So all that to say, this is incredibly stinging and very scathing. But David has the chance here to exercise wisdom. He opts not to. And so what does he do? But he winds up sending messengers to get her. Now we go back to the Genesis prologue, and we have the woman. She took some of its fruit and ate it. And we know what winds up happening after that. So we don't have the exact phrase here of David taking her, but to send messengers and get her, the idea is represented in total. And so with that, we are firmly embedded now in the garden narrative of Genesis, because the serpent has found a way to slither into the story. And while it's not been the existential threats of either Goliath or Nahash, because granted, this Nahash is dead. He was the threat in Saul's moment of squashing the serpent. Now his son up here in 1 Samuel 10, Hanun is going to become David's Nahash, his other serpent. So David's had both one, now two serpents here to squash, and he squashed them both. But after this moment, riding this wave of momentum, and in the interlude between the beginning of that skirmish until it's concluded, the following year or spring, the serpent winds up slithering his way into the story here in chapter 11. And now, after, just like we have with Saul in 1 Samuel 13, when he defiantly rebels against the Lord by offering that sacrifice. And then after that, the author just continues to denigrate Saul in every chance he gets in the story by speaking about how Saul has now become so paranoid. He just wants to ravage David. He is spending resource upon resource, and of course, amassing more and more men, and is even killing innocent people for the sake of trying to hunt David down and simply kill him. After the context of chapter 11, we have the same thing going on in this story, that David's trajectory is going to continue to engage in something of a downward spiral until we get to the very tail end of 2 Samuel, when in the 24th and final chapter, we have something of a redemptive moment for David. But anyway, considering that now we are in the garden narrative, 2 Samuel 12, Nathan the prophet said, "Why have you despised the Lord's command by doing what I consider evil?" And he goes on to promise David that because you despised the Lord, you took the wife of Uriah to be your wife, the sword will never depart from your house. Now, moving beyond this, what we're going to see in 2 Samuel 13, and I highlight this now because we're not going to have the chance to talk about this. Like I said, after next week's lesson material, we're going to be jumping right on into the context of 1 Kings chapter 3. So we will have no opportunity to examine any of the material from 2 Samuel 13 to 24, except for this evening. But it will serve our purpose here of helping us understand how the author is creating the flow of the story as he builds it. So one of David's sons, as many of them now become full-grown men, Absalom, we have something of a moment here in which a story we're probably all somewhat familiar with, that David's oldest son, by his wife Ahinoam, that being Amnon, is infatuated with his half-sister Tamar, who is also Absalom's full sister. And of course, he winds up seducing her, and by virtue of that, he rapes her. And by humiliating her the way that he does, Absalom wants to, in this very vindictive and vengeful way, strike out at Amnon and kill him. And he orchestrates this very thing at a feast in which he has all of the princes invited to, and then he gives the command to his servants, watch Amnon until he is in a good mood from the wine, and when I give you the order to strike him, then you will kill him. Do not be afraid to raise your hand against one of the king's sons, because I have commanded you to do that very thing, almost sounding like Moses to Joshua. All that to say that if you're thinking sharply on the Genesis prologue, which for the most part I kind of terminate at the end of chapter 3, but it's important, it's imperative here to consider the events that immediately befall the first image bearers after they wind up leaving the garden at the end of chapter 3, because in chapter 4 we pick up with the first two children that are born to them that we have record of, and that being Cain and Abel. So when we move beyond chapter 13, now Absalom has, like his father David did in days past, he seeks to impose he seeks to impose exile upon himself. He runs in a fearful manner to the kingdom of Gerar, where he has family. He's connected distantly to the king of Gerar at the time by relation. And through this, what happens here is that for some time, years wind up passing until we eventually have Joab, David's nephew and the commander of his army, and has been for quite some time, at least since the day, while he was a valiant warrior in David's army before this moment, but since the day that David promised that position of the commander of the army to whoever led the charge that brought the defeat of the Jebusites and the handing over of the city Jerusalem to David's control, and that just happened to be Joab, aspiring to that position. Joab has noticed that David's heart has softened, and he wants Absalom back, in whatever way David has in the nonverbal way made that known. So Joab concocts a plan, and he decides to bring a woman to give, as Nathan did in condemning David for what he did with Bathsheba and Uriah. He uses this woman from a little city known as Tekoa to ask for an audience with the king and to ask the king to render judgment in a particular case. And what she's really doing is giving a parable, like Nathan did to David, to illustrate the reality of an actual real life situation that is going on in David's house that is a source of conflict, controversy, and scandal. So this woman has the audience with the king, and as she has got his ear inclined to her, she says, your servant, that being her, had two sons. They were fighting in the field. Now notice this. The sons that she is talking about are actually not hers, because again, she is using this literary device, this parable, as a way of casting a truth alongside what has really happened in the house of David. And the two sons that she's referring to are the older brother Amnon and the younger brother Absalom. But when Absalom orchestrated for Amnon's execution, that was not in the field, that was around the dinner table at Absalom's own house, where he had invited Amnon and all the sons of David. So when she uses this particular phrase of fighting in the field and no one to separate them, and one struck the other and killed him, that should immediately take us back to a story we're all familiar with. And that is what's happening in Genesis chapter 4, when Cain said to his brother Abel, let's go out to the field. And while they were in the field, Cain attacked his brother Abel and killed him. So she's presenting this conflict in this shadowed and veiled way between Amnon and Absalom that's created the circumstance in which now Amnon is dead, obviously, and Absalom is in self-imposed exile and is afraid to come home because he would incur David's wrath and judgment. That she is painting this picture using the story of Cain and Abel. And what do we have as we continue to appreciate the words that are being exchanged between both David and the woman before he winds up finding out what's really at play here? The woman goes on to press David. She says, please, may the king invoke the Lord your God so that the avenger of blood will not increase the loss and they will not eliminate my son. David says, as the Lord lives, he vowed, not a hair of your son will fall to the ground. So in other words, he essentially winds up pardoning her son and says that he will not be harmed. At least he will not be harmed by anyone who is seeking vengeance, which is actually prescribed by the Mosaic law, that it's required that an avenger of blood actually seek the life of the one who has purposely killed or even committed an act of manslaughter that was unintentional. But nonetheless, someone of that family is supposed to avenge the blood of the one who was slain. And so now David, as king, is exercising his right to speak into the situation the justice that he feels is appropriate, which the justice he feels is appropriate is for this man, at least temporarily, to have a stay of execution, that no one will lay a hand on him until perhaps a trial could be rendered and then proper justice in tow. Or maybe David is seeking to completely, totally pardon him. But what do we have but the same desire, well, concern, I should say, on the part of Cain in Genesis chapter 4, where he is saying to the Lord, since you are banishing me today from the face of the earth, and I must hide from your presence and become a restless wonder, whoever finds me will kill me. In other words, they will avenge Abel's blood, and they will do that by taking my life. And the Lord replied to him, in that case, whoever kills Cain will suffer vengeance 7 times over. So it was meant to be, or I should say, the mark that was placed on Cain by the Lord was meant to be a deterrent so that no one would seek to try to take his life. All that to simply say, it didn't quite work out that way for Cain, considering, I was going to say, it didn't quite work out for the sake of turning him around as what was the outcome of this story here with Absalom, because Cain continues apparently to devolve further into chaos and sin, whereas Absalom is temporarily restored. Anyway, going on beyond this, backing up a little bit, though, back to chapter 12, where we have the words of David comforting his wife Bathsheba. He went into her to sleep with her. She gave birth to a son and named him Solomon. And the Lord loved him, and he sent a message through the prophet Nathan saying his covenant name for Solomon would be Jedediah, or beloved of the Lord. Going back to the Genesis 4 story, what winds up happening after the death of Abel and the conversation between Cain and the Lord, and Cain winds up being exiled further east, off into the land of Nod, but Adam becomes intimate with Eve again. She gives birth to another son, raised up in the stead of Abel, and his name is Seth. Now, granted, Solomon is not necessarily raised up to replace dead Amnon. Amnon is not accorded to be a righteous figure in the story by no means, but nonetheless, we do have one of the king's sons who is dead, and now a new son who garners the Lord's favor almost instantaneously from the time of his birth, at no doing or merit or on any merit of his own. And the same can be said here of Seth in the Genesis prologue, as goes the idea that Seth is immediately, almost upon his birth, told to be the one who is the blessing of the Lord that God is giving to the image bearers to be raised up in the stead of the slain righteous brother Abel. And of course, it's from the line of Seth that we will wind up getting the descendants of Noah and Abram and so forth. All that to say, the parallels have greatly abounded in this story of David's time, as the prophet Nathan has spoken to him this curse of how the sword will continue to loom large over David's house for the rest of his days. And now that wrath has already started to play out in an egregious way. So what will wind up happening the further we dive into this story is that we will slowly start to see that David's wisdom begins to wane, whereas he was on the upward trend to ascend to the summit of the mountain of the Lord. And I'm using that metaphorically because I'm looking at that through the lens of Psalm 24, when David asks the question, who may ascend the mountain of the Lord, but the one who has clean hands and a pure heart. That's obvious from the rest of David's writings preserved in the Psalms that that's what his intent is. He wants to ascend to the mountain of the Lord. He wants to meet the Lord there at the summit in his sanctuary, right? All that to simply say that David recognizes for a fair portion of his life that the one who is wise and heeds the words of the Lord will be the one who, in the way the Lord allows through the sacrificial system, to be able to do that, because the Lord looks upon, smiles upon, appreciates a grateful and obedient heart. But now, through the rest of the story on up through the end of chapter 22, at least, David is not presented in that light. And if anything, we see this snowballing effect in which David, instead of being presented as the possible candidate who fulfills the long-awaited expectation of not only the snake smasher of Genesis 3:15, but also the very kingly figure that Hannah has been talking about, who's not only a king, but a little further down in that chapter, when we have the focus being placed on Eli now, the debauchery of him and his sons, and this nameless prophet who winds up coming to pronounce judgment upon the house of Eli, and says the Lord will raise up a faithful priest. And the wording of that is a little suspect, because he says the priest will walk before the Lord's anointed, whereas many contend that it should perhaps read before me, speaking as if the Lord is saying about this priest the Lord will raise up, that this priest will walk faithfully before him. And the reason why I bring this up is because some of the things that are said with respect to this priest, that he will be a man after the Lord's own heart, or that he will know the heart and mind of the Lord, really is the way I guess it's put, is very close to the formula that is given of David in 1 Samuel 13 before we even get to the introduction of David into the story. And so all that to simply say, it's as if we are combining the role of king and priest through the words of Hannah and this nameless prophet in 1 Samuel chapter 2, all that to say that David was the aspiring candidate to fill this role, and for a time did, but now he has been knocked squarely out of that position, and we are waiting for someone now to fill that vacancy that David has left for us. All that to say, let's consider how the story continues to spiral out of control. After Absalom had fled to Geshur and had been there for 3 years, David longed to go to Absalom. And notice who appreciates this. Joab, the very son of Zeruiah and nephew to David, realizes that David has longed to go to Absalom, and he wants to be the one to restore, not for the sake of trying to garner David's favor, because Joab has position, and he seemingly, from what the author tells us, has no greater aspirations than to simply sit where he is. He doesn't want the throne for himself. He just simply wants to live to serve and prop up David, because by virtue of that, he will continue to be able to serve in this position as commander. So Joab is the one who winds up orchestrating this chance at reunion and restoration. Now, it's important here that we understand that because of what Absalom did, that yes, he is guilty of bloodshed and he should be put on trial, and he is actually worthy of death, if that's what the king decides. Could it be unjust for the king to pardon him? Maybe that might be in the eyes of the beholder, but nonetheless, assuming that David would lean upon the Lord for the right response, and if the Lord allowed Absalom to be pardoned, that in spite of what anybody else might think about that, David would go with what the Lord is wanting. All that to simply say, at least in the moment, it's the fact that David should be restored to his son, who is imposed exile upon himself, but David will not bring himself to move to his son to bring him back in spite of that sin. It's almost like it's an inversion of the parable of what we often call the prodigal son, and while that should really be called, I guess, the parable of the elder brother. All that to simply say that the younger brother is the one who went off to a foreign country and he squandered all of his inheritance, and he winds up coming to his senses, broke, destitute, and when he comes back to his father, he is willing to renounce any position within the family because he recognizes he is not even worthy to be called a son. He would be blessed to be simply treated as a slave, but yet the father is willing to overlook, pardon, and forgive. Granted, that kid did not commit any murderous crimes as Absalom did, but considering the reason why Absalom did what he did, a rapist like Amnon should be stoned and put to death. But all that to simply say, what happens here is that Joab orchestrates this. And in the end, after the conversation David has with this woman of Tekoa, he asks her, "Be honest with me, did Joab put you up to all this?" So even David realizes that Joab is the one who instigated this. Now, why is this important? Because if you have read the story, every word up to this moment, you'll know that Joab is not a wise person. Joab is a self-aggrandizing, prideful person who wants position, he wants power, he wants privilege. He doesn't want the throne, but he wants to go as high as he possibly can. And considering the fact that he is kin to David, one might think that this would simply be granted versus being earned. But David does not favor his family above anyone else, and he doesn't simply seem to assign positions out willy-nilly without placing stringent criteria, at least on some of them, like being commander of the army. Once Joab was rightfully given that position because he earned it, it was threatened. It was threatened before. Once the battle commenced between David, crowned king, and Hebron, and then eventually, 7 years later, winds up being crowned king over all Israel. But when that happens at the expense of the man who Saul appointed to be David's replacement commander, that being Abner, a kinsman of Saul, who sided with and propped up the last surviving descendant, or I should say last surviving son of Saul, that being Ishbosheth, supported his bid for being king over the other tribes of Israel outside of Judah, and then led the army against David's army during the tenure of that civil war. But once Ishbosheth eventually winds up turning on Abner, Abner, feeling largely unappreciated for his services and loyalty, defects from Ishbosheth and goes to David and is willing now to do everything he can in his power to convince the elders of the remaining tribes of Israel and even the army to abandon Ishbosheth and then give their loyalty and allegiance to David. David, here's the point, wants to make Abner commander of his army in place of Joab, because Joab has already won that spot. Let me rephrase that. Joab is currently the itinerant commander because David doesn't lead all the armed forces of Israel. But once the kingdom is consolidated under David, it seems like he intends to make Abner commander of the army in place of Joab. Joab chases Abner down, and also by virtue of the fact that Abner, in a previous skirmish, killed Joab's brother, and Joab is now wanting vengeance upon Abner for that very crime. He winds up killing Abner in secret. David finds out about this, and he comes to wind up despising Joab in the end for this. So all that to simply kind of story build a little bit for Joab and recognize the fact Joab's not a wise man by no means. But nonetheless, Joab seems to be the one who, through the remainder of these story panels, is the one who is exercising wisdom, whereas David has just simply fallen off the wagon. We see this more evident when we get to the point where David, seemingly no longer being the snake-smashing figure that he once was, in 2 Samuel 18, now we have gotten to the point where Absalom has not only been invited back into Israel, but he has surmised that his father is no longer worthy of being king, and over a period of years seeks to systematically undermine and usurp his father's authority. And he winds up amassing the hearts of many people who he has virtually stolen from his father by lying upon his father, and again conspiring by virtue of the way he props himself up in the city gates to be something of a man who will give justice to the people, while David is purposefully denying them justice, to the extent where enough people defect secretly from David that Absalom feels confident now that if he were to suddenly and spontaneously have himself proclaimed as king with the powerful enough entourage that he has, leading him from Hebron, I believe is where he crowns himself, to Jerusalem, that at that moment he could perhaps do battle with David and withstand the forces of David's own army and have David executed and ultimately take the kingdom from him. So after that moment has happened, but David has wisely perceived, I use that as something of a paradox considering what I'm talking about now, that David's kind of not being very wise, but at least discerning enough that in this particular moment, he recognizes what his son is doing, and he escapes Jerusalem by the Lord's hand and will, of course, before Absalom has a chance to take the city and ultimately kill David in the eyes of everyone else. And David has crossed over the Jordan, and then eventually, after a little time has passed, Absalom is able to strategize with his counselors about how to go out and meet David on the battlefield. And so David's forces and Absalom's forces, and many of the men who fight under Absalom were once a part of David's army or served as advisors under him. All that to simply say, it's clear that they have defected and who their allegiance and loyalty lies to now. But when the skirmish is undertaken, eventually Absalom, who leads his men into battle, winds up getting caught by his thick, luscious hair in the branches of the tree and is hanging suspended off the ground. And many of David's men who encounter him are perplexed. They don't know what to do, because the wise thing to do, and at least for any enemy combatant, would be to kill him, right? Especially one who is the head of the snake. He is the chief of the chief threat in the moment. And if anyone had killed him, if it was anybody else other than Absalom, no doubt would have been congratulated by David. But this is ultimately what David wound up telling the men: protect the young man Absalom for me. In other words, don't kill him. But Joab recognizes, he said, look, even if I had the weight of 1,000 pieces of silver in my hand, I would not raise my hand. I'm sorry, rephrase that. This is what the man replies to Joab when Joab asks, why didn't you kill him? He said, even if I had 1,000 pieces of silver in my hand, I would not raise my hand against the king's son. For we heard what the king commanded you, Abishai, and Ittai. Do not kill Absalom. So Joab knows clearly what David wants out of this. But Joab says, whatever. He takes 3 spears in his hand and he thrusts all of them into Absalom's chest. He makes sure the job is done. And while he does that, while Absalom was still alive in the oak tree, and then 10 young men who were Joab's armor bearers surrounded Absalom, struck him, and killed him. And now the battle is over. So all that to simply say that if you consider just the simple nature of the fact that both Nahash and Saul's story was the existential threat, the serpent, who was threatening to enslave God's people. And of course, he was the threat against God's covenant people. And Goliath, the same, dressed like the snake, considering his bronze scale armor, whereas Nahash's name is a play on the Hebrew root word that is often translated either bronze or serpent. With Goliath, it's his appearance. So snakes that start out in the stories of both Saul and David, and they both successfully squash those snakes. Here we have yet another snake, because Absalom is the existential threat against God's anointed king. We have nothing in the story whatsoever that would remotely suggest that God is turning David over into Absalom's hand, or that God was leading Absalom to do this, to usurp and take David off the throne. David recognizes, if the Lord is done with me, then may it be so. He says that while he is fleeing Jerusalem. He is willing to hand the crown off to the next person who the Lord raised up in his place. He recognizes what it is that he has done. And if the Lord does not delight in him any longer, then that's the Lord's prerogative. But just as David was absolutely unwilling to raise his hand against Saul because he was the Lord's anointed, the same can be said if that was considered a righteous action on the part of David, then Absalom should not be willing to raise his hand against the Lord's anointed. In fact, throughout the rest of the stories of David's son, for every Davidic king that was noted to be evil that was assassinated, what winds up happening to the conspirators that assassinate the king? The next king winds up having those men executed because they raised their hand against God's anointed king. So it's not what is supposed to happen. Absalom has done that. He has driven the king from his kingdom, basically. And now he is the existential threat against God's people, though some have allied themselves with Absalom. Yet ultimately, Absalom will not be the king that God would want ruling and reigning over his people, that will turn Eden into perhaps a den of vice and debauchery and whatever the case might be. So all that to say, Absalom has become the new snake. David should recognize that for what it is, considering his interactions with Goliath and Hanun, but he doesn't. And because of his proximity and level of familiarity with this particular snake, he wants this one kept alive. He wants the threat kept alive. Joab, the unwise person who was yet wise enough to recognize that the king was not going to bridge the gap between him and his son Absalom and go the distance to have him restored, but he works to do that behind the scenes. Now, Joab is the one who seemingly turns on Absalom and executes Absalom himself because of the threat that Absalom has become after his restoration to David. And David won't do it, so Joab has to. After this, David begins to lament his son. The king was deeply moved when he hears the words, and he went up to the chamber of the city gate, and he wept. And as he walked, he cried, my son Absalom, if only I had died instead of you, Absalom, my son, my son. The words are reported to Joab, and notice what he said when he is told, the king is weeping, he's mourning over Absalom. And that day's victory was turned into mourning for all the troops, because on that day the troops heard the king is grieving over his son. So they returned to the city quietly that day, like troops come in when they are humiliated after fleeing in battle. Notice that the thrill and excitement and joy of victory, of which this is, has been sapped from them in every possible way. They feel denigrated and absolutely humiliated now because of the way that David is according this victory as ultimately a loss. And he is almost wishing that he had died in his son's place. And if that was the case, then what was all this for, right? I mean, what was the need for leaving Jerusalem and coming here away from their families or taking their families with them to go with David out of loyalty and love all the way across the Jordan, and then putting their lives on the line to defend him, to keep his kingdom intact when he was willing to just die anyway? Then why didn't they just do that, right? I mean, one could easily surmise that. Joab went up to the king and he said, today you have shamed all of your soldiers, those who saved your life, as well as your sons, your wives, your concubines. Because what would Absalom have done with all the rest of David's sons had he become king? By loving your enemies and hating those who love you. Now notice this, loving your enemies. Yes, we see in that the familiarity of Jesus's words, love your enemies, pray for those who despitefully use you and whatnot. But that was not necessarily the words of Moses. And on top of that, considering what the context is here, as goes the fact that when you're fighting war, things are just a little bit different. All that to say that had David simply loved his enemy here, that Absalom would have taken David's head. Anyway, today you have made it clear to the commanders and soldiers that they mean nothing to you. In fact, today I know that if Absalom were alive and all of us were dead, it would be fine with you. Now get up, go out, encourage your soldiers, for I swear by the Lord that if you do not go out, not a man will remain with you tonight. And this will be worse for you than all the trouble that has come upon you from your youth until now, because essentially David would have lost his kingdom. But look who it is that notices this. It's not David, it's Joab. And it's not for the sake of keeping David installed as king, because David is awesome. It's for the sake of the fact that David himself recognized at a point before this that God prospered his kingdom for the sake of God's people. It was for God that God did this, not for David, right? And it's all because God continues to delight in David by virtue of his grace and prop David up, that he has allowed David to escape all of this. Now, after this is all said and done, as David is being restored to his kingdom, in 2 Samuel 17, when we're in the height of the conflict between Absalom and David, but before Absalom goes out to do battle with David, he has appointed a man by the name of Amasa over the army, or at least the remnant of the army that has decided to defect from David and remain in Jerusalem. That he has appointed this particular person named Amasa over the army. Well, now that David has been restored to his rightful place as king and is back in Jerusalem, 2 Samuel 19, we have David trying to order these affairs, tie up the loose ends of what had happened here with this conflict with Absalom. And he says, and tell Amasa, aren't you my flesh and blood? May God punish me and do so severely. And we've heard those words several times before in Scripture as a way of invoking a curse upon oneself through the taking of an oath if this person does not hold true to their words. If you don't become commander of my army from now on instead of Joab. We can surmise the reasons David might have for this, considering what Joab has done in the past before the incident with Absalom. Maybe he's a little vindictive now because of the way Joab accorded him after the defeat of Absalom and whatnot. It very well may be. But consider this. If Amasa, part of David's own family, joined with Absalom over David, and we consider what Absalom is in the context of the story, he is the new serpent on the scene, then what does that make Amasa if now he is essentially the second most powerful man in Israel as leader over the army? He is a serpent as well. What should David, if he is the candidate of Hannah's promise of a king and the prophet's promise of a faithful priest walking before the Lord, if David is that figure who is ultimately stretching those words of David and that prophet back to Genesis 3:15 as the snake smasher who is coming from the woman as the seed of the woman, what should David be doing? Not propping up snakes. He should be smashing snakes. But instead, Joab, very next chapter later, he finds Amasa and he asks him, "Are you well, my brother?" And then with his right hand, Joab grabbed Amasa by the beard to kiss him. It's a customary greeting and whatnot. But Amasa does not recognize that Joab has a sword in his hand, and so Joab stabbed him in the stomach, and eventually Amasa winds up dying a rather miserable death. But all this to say, it would seem that Joab is yet willing to smash another snake. First Absalom, and now Amasa. And Joab is not supposed to be accorded as the hero of the story. It's as if to say that now David has fallen low enough that he is basically passed under the bar almost of what Joab has been in the story up until this point. And so all that to say that what is quite clear at this moment is that David is not the seed. He is a conduit by which the seed will ultimately come, but he is not the answer to the equation that we are given in Genesis 3:15, nor ultimately the definitive bearer of the promise in Genesis 49 of the descendant of Judah, to whom all the nations will become obedient unto. But what is decisively clear is the fact that he is in need of the seed himself, because he is not the seed, because of his acts of debauchery and whatnot, because he is now swimming in a cesspool of the consequences of his own poor choices. Ultimately, what has wound up coming on the heels of this is that David has removed himself from being the candidate of the promise. And ultimately now we see that David is in need of the redemption that the one who is the true seed of the woman will provide. If anything, he has become the woman, essentially, in the Genesis 3 story, by virtue of what he saw with Bathsheba, what he did in taking her, and despising the wisdom of the Lord, and what he had been given and blessed by from the Lord, all to have what he ultimately wants for himself. So, toward the end of this story, we see in 2 Samuel 24, the Lord's anger burns against Israel and he stirs up David. The chronicler says that it's Satan who does so, but either way, all of them working in tandem to ultimately accomplish this goal of David ordering a census of all of his military fighting soldiers. And look who it is who questions the wisdom of this. And even if you read the story of what the chronicler has to say, doesn't even finish the census because of the wrath that God is bringing upon the people of Israel. And from the beginning of it until the moment that he completed it, it's clear that Joab was fighting against this tooth and nail. But anyway, he says, so the king said to Joab, the commander of the army, "Go through all the tribes of Israel from Dan to Beersheba, register the troops so I can know their number." And Joab replied, "May the Lord your God multiply the troops 100 times more than they are, while my lord the king looks on. But why does my lord the king want to do this?" And yet this seems to be David's final act of rebellion against the Lord, of which David recognizes it for what it is. And when Gad comes to him, I believe it's Gad, it perhaps could be Nathan. I'll have to look back on the story, because both Gad and Nathan are working simultaneously as prophets in David's court, relaying the words of the Lord. All that to simply say, it may have been Nathan who comes to him and says, "This is what you've done, and this is what the Lord is offering you. You have one of three choices." And David says, "May I fall upon the mercy of the Lord, for he is far more gracious than my enemies." And so God sends plague, tens of thousands die. But a spiritual entity is the one who was involved in this, seemingly the very same one who may have been the one who was taking the lives of the firstborn in Egypt that night when Moses set up the practice of and regulation of the Passover feast. And the substitutionary offering given on the part of Israel so that they would escape the wrath that the Lord was bringing upon Israel. All that to say that when the destroyer has positioned himself above the threshing floor of Araunah, the Jebusite, eventually what winds up happening is that Gad, working with David by commanding him to go, as the Lord has commanded through Gad, that David ultimately do this, to go up after he's purchased the threshing floor of Arguana, to go up and set up an altar to the Lord on the threshing floor. So David went up in obedience to Gad's command. So now David, by virtue of his pride, has been humbled, and he is now submitting himself to the Lord's direction again. And David bought the threshing floor and the oxen for 20 ounces of silver. He built an altar to the Lord, and he offered burnt offerings and fellowship offerings, a formula we see many times over in the stories of these kings and various other key figures. All that to say that's a combination of the two, the Olah, ascending up into the summit of the Lord through the body and the ashes of the burning carcass of the animal that's laid on the altar in the offerer's place. And of course, the fellowship offerings, which is in the King James Version translated as a peace offering. It's a picnic style meal with the Lord. All that to simply say it was a means of restoring fellowship with the Lord again after what had just happened with respect to this silly census. And the Lord was receptive to prayer for the land, and the plague on Israel ended. And that's ultimately how David's saga in the books of Samuel winds up ending. And all that to say, again, while David has his moment of redemption in his story arc, what we ultimately wind up seeing at the end of it all is that while David had a meteoric rise to the assumed position of him being the figure that Hannah was speaking of and the prophet that was speaking to Eli, yet what we ultimately see is that at the end of this, David is clearly not that one. And if he is not that one, then we must be awaiting the one who will come. Now, obviously, the one who is awaiting, or that the people living through this story in real space and time, and the other readers of this story awaiting for more chapters and installments to be added after the books of Samuel, which ultimately Samuel was a part of Kings. And so when all of this was being written together, it was probably being written utilizing sources that were already chronicling these events. And I don't mean to say chronicling by connecting in some way to the books of Chronicles, just the act in and of itself of chronicling material. We have references to several different literary sources in the Bible itself that are not a part of the Bible, right? All that to say that while they were keeping track of these events, that they perhaps were looking on with great anticipation as to who it will be that will rise up in David's stead, that will ultimately lead them to victory over the serpent by being the faithful seed of the woman that does not succumb to the temptations of the serpent. And thankfully, we have Jesus, our Messiah, who has done that very thing and who frees us day in and day out to not have to be enslaved or shackled to our slavish obedience to sin that we once lived under, but can now truthfully appreciate the goodness of God in enduing us with the power of His Spirit to live. To live faithfully under the guidance of the Torah and the wisdom that He has given us, so that we may honor Him in all of our words and all of our actions, and even in our very thoughts, so that we do not have to give in to our carnal desires, but instead can walk by the Spirit and reap the fruit of the Spirit, right? So thanks for listening. I hope this was educational in some way, as we've learned a little bit more about how the author of the story has orchestrated these events in such a way that it takes us back to the Genesis prologue to appreciate how David was pictured in all of this. And in a lot of ways, he even repeated the very story arc we had with Saul, so that if Saul was discredited as being that messianic figure, that David, his successor, is not that person either. So until we meet next time, friends, go with God and His grace and goodness. We thank you, Lord, for the time that we've had, and we pray for greater clarity and insight that only you can give, God. We are so appreciative of all that you do and giving us this time and space. And of course, the resources made available to us outside of the Bible, as great and as wonderful as the resource that is, yet you have gifted men and women throughout the ages to understand the keen insight that you have given them, so that we, looking on these ancient words and sometimes scratching our heads wondering what they mean and how we are to make sense of these stories, that ultimately you share that insight with us through them. And we are grateful for how you have blessed them. And may you bless us as we share this information with others, all for your glory's sake. We ask this in your holy name. Amen.